Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're trying to figure out who really calls the shots in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's a big question.
Because if you step back for a second, forget the usual stuff like GDP or military size.
hmm
Is the real power now? Well, is it still armies and navies? Or has something fundamental shifted?
Like algorithms.
Exactly. Algorithms, huge piles of data, and maybe the drive of just a few key people in tech and finance.
It's definitely a shift you have to understand. If you want to know what's going on globally, you really do need to look past the headlines, past the presidents and prime ministers, and see the actual systems these new players control.
Right. And we've got a lot to draw on today. Our sources cover, well, everything from how AI actually works, deep learning stuff,
To really complex corporate finance, the LBOs, the whole Wall Street angle.
and yeah, even looking at the personalities, right? People like Musk, Bezos, comparing them to, say, the old guard like Rockefeller, or
hmm
Vanderbilt.
A really wide net.
So the challenge for us, I think, is tying all that together. You've got the AI race happening over here, crazy financial deals over there, and these larger-than-life figures driving it. How does it all connect?
Well, our mission really is to synthesize that,
Yeah.
to see how that shift happened from controlling factories and railroads.
Open industrial model.
Yeah, to controlling information flows and technology, and also understanding the kind of extreme risk-taking involved now and how leverage works in this new world. It's about mapping how this new power is built and used.
Okay, so maybe an analogy helps. I was thinking about it like architecture. The old power, the Rockefellers. It's like a huge, solid Gilded Age mansion.
Right. Stone, heavy foundations.
Built on controlling physical things you can touch, oil, steel, railroads. It's visible, imposing, takes ages to change.
Sired, but maybe slow.
But the new power base, the tech tycoon, that feels more like a high-speed data center.
Ah, interesting. Okay.
Climate-controlled, invisible cables, everything optimized for speed and flow. Its value isn't the building itself, it's the data moving through it, right? A monopoly on information.
Light speed versus freight train speed. I like that.
So let's start with the fuel for that data center, the data itself.
Okay, so diving into AI, specifically deep learning, the sources we looked at really hammer home this almost counterintuitive idea about where the big breakthroughs are coming from now.
It's not the lone genius in the lab anymore, that whole myth.
Well, that person still matters for the really big theoretical leaps pushing the boundaries, but those are rare. The sources say maybe once every few decades.
Okay.
In the meantime, for the stuff that's actually disrupting industries now, the priority is totally flipped. It's about quantity, data quantity.
More data beats a smarter algorithm. Is that basically it?
That's the core insight, yeah. It grounds the whole AI race. The phrase that kept coming up was, no data like more data. We're in an era where the sheer size of the data set you train your model on is the most critical factor for getting something that works reliably in the real world.
But why, though? Why does just having more data make such a difference? Does it just overwhelm the errors?
Sort of, yeah. It's about how these neural networks learn. A massive data set lets the model generalize better. It sees so many examples, so many variations, that it learns to ignore the noise, the slight inaccuracies in the input.
Okay. So if you feed it enough slightly messy real-world data, it figures out the underlying patterns anyway.
Exactly. It filters out the statistical noise because the signal's repeated so many times across millions or billions of data points.
So the surprising thing is you could have a team of just, say, competent AI engineers.
Mid-level guys, yeah.
And they could potentially build a better performing AI than some world-class famous researcher if that first team just has way, way more data to work with.
That's what the evidence points to, consistently. The bottleneck right now for applying AI in finance or logistics or healthcare or whatever, it's usually not some super complex math problem. It's just getting enough relevant data organized and processed.
Wow. Okay. So whoever controls the data fire hose basically dictates the pace of progress.
And that leads us straight to the geopolitical competition, specifically China.
Right. The sources are pretty clear. China is really the only country positioned as a true counterweight to the U.S. in AI right now.
And a huge part of that comes down to how effectively, and maybe aggressively, Chinese companies capture data about real-world offline behavior at a scale nobody else matched.
Offline. So not just what people click on, but what they actually do.
Exactly. This was the whole O2O, online to offline boom. Western companies historically were great at tracking online stuff, searches, clicks, website visits, online purchases. But Chinese tech giants managed to get incredibly granular, real-time data on people's physical lives, where they went, when they went there, what they bought, offline meals, groceries, movie tickets, massages, you name it.
How did they even capture all that? Was it just the phones?
Phones were part of it, but the absolute key, according to the sources, was the digital payment system becoming ubiquitous. WeChat Pay, Alipay. Once everything started being paid for digitally.
Every transaction leaves a trace.
A precise, time-stamped, location-stamped trace. It cracked open what used to be a black box, all those cash transactions, small vendor purchases. Suddenly, tech companies had this incredibly detailed map of real-world consumer activity building up minute by minute. That just wasn't happening elsewhere to the same degree.
Can you give an example of that scale?
Yeah, the bike-sharing phenomenon is a really vivid one from the sources. Companies like Mobike, Ofo, they didn't just put out bikes, they flooded cities with millions of them.
Oh, yeah, I remember seeing pictures. Bikes everywhere.
But those weren't just bikes. They were internet-connected tracking devices, IoT sensors on wheels. They traced tens of millions of daily commutes, short trips, movements around the city. The sheer volume of that location data, the granularity of tracking physical movement across huge urban populations, it completely dwarfed what, say, Uber or Lyft were collecting in their early days.
So you have this massive data advantage driven by tech companies, but presumably with government encouragement, or at least tolerance.
Which points to a really fundamental difference in political culture that the sources explore. It's this idea of techno-utilitarianism in China's approach over the last few decades.
Techno-utilitarianism. Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It means the leadership is willing to push, even mandate, big technological upgrades across society to maximize what they see as the broader social good or national economic advantage.
Even if it causes major disruption.
Even if it comes with significant downsides for specific groups or individuals or even entire existing industries, the focus is on the overall system's efficiency and scale, not necessarily protecting the current players.
Like the push for electric vehicles or AI and surveillance.
Or think about things like solar panels or steel production. The government poured in massive investment, mandated certain goals.
Which led to those huge supply gluts, right? Flooded the global market.
Exactly. Bankrupted companies elsewhere caused trade friction. But from their perspective, it also rapidly accelerated China's capability in those sectors and arguably accelerated global clean tech adoption, even if it was messy. They seem to view that kind of short-term chaos as an acceptable price for long-term strategic gain.
Okay, so that's one approach. How does that compare to the U.S.?
The sources paint the U.S. political culture as much more risk-averse, particularly when it comes to the government actively trying to pick winners or fund major industrial upgrades with taxpayer money.
Why? Because if it fails, you get attacked for wasting money.
Pretty much. American politicians, the thinking goes, see it as incredibly risky. If a government-backed tech initiative succeeds, the success is often just attributed to the private sector anyway. But if it fails,
It becomes a huge political weapon for the opposition. Solyndra comes to mind.
right, so the path of least resistance politically is often just to stay out of what the sources call the messy business of upgrading an economy.
So this difference in appetite for risk, for actively shaping the technological base, that's a key factor in this AI superpower race.
It seems to be a core differentiator, yeah. One side is willing to mandate change, absorb the shocks. The other is perhaps more hesitant, wary of the political fallout of failure.
And speaking of fallout, this whole AI race has massive implications for jobs, doesn't it?
Huge. And not just the ones we usually think about.
Yeah, everyone talks about automation hitting manufacturing, truck driving, blue-collar jobs.
And it will. It already is.
Yeah.
But the sources are really emphasizing the impact on white-collar work. Things like accounting, paralegal work, coding, journalism, customer service. Jobs that involve manipulating information are suddenly looking very vulnerable to these new AI models.
Which is scary. So what are the proposed solutions? Anything concrete coming out of Silicon Valley where a lot of this tech originates?
Well, the thinking seems to fall into three main buckets, sort of the three R's, as the sources describe them.
Okay, what are they?
The first R is retrain. This is the most optimistic view, basically.
The idea that people can just learn new skills.
Yeah. AI shifts the demand, maybe eliminates some tasks, but creates new ones. So if workers can adapt, learn the new tools, focus on skills AI can't do, then maybe overall employment stays stable. It frames it as a skills gap problem.
But is that realistic given the potential speed? Can you really retrain millions of people that quickly if, say, AI suddenly gets really good at writing basic legal documents or code?
That's the big question, the core tension, which leads to the second R, reduce.
Reduce. working hours.
Exactly. This view accepts that AI probably will reduce the total demand for human labor, but maybe we can absorb that by shifting societal norms, moving to a standard 3-day or 4-day work week, for instance. Spread the remaining work around more people.
Okay, that's a bigger shift. Redefining productivity.
A fundamental shift, yeah. And then there's the third R, which is the most radical prediction. Redistribute.
Meaning?
This camp believes AI's impact will be so profound that retraining or reducing hours just won't cut it. They predict widespread displacement of workers whose skills become obsolete almost overnight.
So if people can't earn money through labor?
Then the immense wealth generated by AI, which accrues to the owners of the AI models, and the data have to be redistributed somehow to maintain social stability.
Universal basic income, that kind of thing.
That's often mentioned, yeah. Though the sources also caution that UBI might not be the perfect solution, maybe something more targeted or structured is needed. But the core idea is some form of large-scale income redistribution becomes necessary.
Wow. Retrain, reduce, redistribute. 3 very different futures.
And the consensus seems to be that the impact is coming, potentially very fast, and across almost all sectors.
Okay, so we've got data as this new, powerful lever, creating maybe new kinds of monopolies. But the tactics for building power, the ruthlessness, the strategy, the use of leverage, that's not entirely new, is it?
Not at all. To really get the modern tech or finance tycoon, you almost have to look back at the original empire builders. The playbook has roots.
So let's start with the classic model. Capital, monopolies, Rockefeller.
Rockefeller's the perfect starting point. His power was all about consolidation, absolute control over essential physical infrastructure and commodities. Oil, pipelines, refineries, transport.
Tangible assets.
Right. And the sources point out this really interesting tension in him, almost a duality.
You mean between how careful he was with small amounts of money versus how bold he was with big bets?
Exactly that. You have stories of him being incredibly thrifty personally, like obsessively checking tiny details in accounts, or apparently returning an expensive fur coat someone gave him because it was too much.
Seems cautious, right? Meticulous.
Yeah, penny pinching almost. But then contrast that with these unbelievably audacious business moves, like jumping headfirst into the Lima oil fields in Ohio and Indiana.
Even though everyone said the oil was unusable, the sour oil.
Yeah, his own partner, scientists, everyone warned him off it. It was full of sulfur and nobody knew how to refine it properly.
Yeah.
But Rockefeller just had this almost fanatical optimism. He bet huge, put up millions of his own money, convinced they would find a chemical solution even though it didn't exist yet. That willingness to take massive science-defying risks defined his expansion.
So extreme personal thrift, extreme commercial risk.
Wow.
And how did he handle competitors? Just crushed them.
Sometimes, yeah. He could be brutal. The sources mention tactics like buying up every single available storage barrel in a region or monopolizing the local railroad tank cars just to starve a competitor out of business.
Yeah.
Pure logistical strangulation.
Ruthless.
But often, his preferred method wasn't just destruction. It was seduction, or maybe co-option. He wanted to acquire their assets and, crucially, their talent. He tried to persuade rival managers to join Standard Oil, offer them positions. His goal wasn't just to win the fight. It was to build the strongest possible team for his monopoly long term.
So absorbing the competition, not just eliminating it.
Right. Build the empire, build the management structure.
Do we see similar models, that old school control of essential services, still playing out today?
Absolutely. The sources point particularly to examples in Asia, tycoons like Li Ka-shing in Hong Kong. His power base wasn't tech. It was built on controlling vital local infrastructure and services and extracting value from that control.
Like the port.
Exactly. His control over Hutchison Whampoa's container terminals in Hong Kong was the bedrock. It generated enormous, steady cash flow that wasn't really tied to the ups and downs of the market.
Like a toll booth on global trade.
Pretty much. And that reliable cash flow gave him the stability to make massive, highly speculative bets in the Hong Kong real estate market, which is notoriously volatile.
And the sources say that port money actually saved him during property crashes?
They do. Investment bankers quoted said that without that consistent cash from the ports, he almost certainly would have gone bankrupt during the big property downturns in the 80s. That infrastructure base was his safety net for taking huge risks elsewhere.
And this control sometimes extends to banks too, right? With potential downsides for everyone else.
Yeah, the sources note that in Southeast Asia, some tycoons gained significant control over local banks. And when you control the banks, especially in a crisis, Your decisions can inflict a lot of collateral damage on ordinary citizens and businesses who rely on that financial system. It concentrates risk.
Okay, so that's the risk mitigation through consolidation model. But then you have figures today who seem to do the opposite. They amplify risk.
That's a key distinction the sources draw. Most entrepreneurs, even successful ones, are fundamentally risk mitigators. They try to identify variables, control uncertainty, hedge their bets.
Makes sense. You want to survive.
But then you have factors like Elon Musk, who the sources present as almost pathological risk amplifiers. They seem drawn to situations where the stakes are highest and the outcome is most uncertain.
And this isn't new for him, apparently, even back in the PayPal days.
His colleagues from back then noted this tendency, a willingness to push things almost to the point of recklessness. The sources even draw a parallel to how he apparently drove his McLaren supercar, just floor it and see how fast it goes. It's about testing limits aggressively.
Are there specific examples from SpaceX or Tesla that show this?
Oh, yeah. There's a really startling anecdote about the Falcon rocket. Right before a crucial launch, they found small cracks in the engine skirt, a vital part.
Okay, that sounds bad. Delay the launch, replace the part, right?
That would be the standard risk-averse approach. Weeks of delay, millions in cost. Musk's response, reportedly, he asked the team, what if we just cut the skirt?
Cut it. With what?
Apparently, they literally took hand shears, trimmed off the cracked section of this multi-million-dollar engine component, and launched the rocket successfully the next day.
That's insane. That level of improvisation on something so critical.
It's terrifying from a traditional engineering or regulatory perspective, and his approach to regulators seems just as confrontational.
Like with the Starship tests.
Exactly. When he felt the FAA was dragging its feet on approving a Starship flight, his move wasn't just to lobby harder. He ordered his team to physically stack the massive Starship vehicle on top of his booster rocket on the launch pad.
Making it very visible, very real.
And his reasoning, stated openly, was that will force the regulators to get off their butts. He uses the physical reality on the ground to force the bureaucratic process to speed up to his timeline. It's manufacturing pressure through action.
Okay, that's one kind of aggressive risk. What about in finance? The LBO world. Leveraged buyouts.
Right, leveraged buyouts, where firms use a lot of borrowed money to buy companies, often using the company's own assets as collateral. It's another form of high-stakes play.
And firms like Blackstone are masters of this.
They are. Part of their success comes from actually fixing up the companies they buy. The sources mention turning a small UK amusement park operator into the global giant Merlin Entertainments. That's value creation.
But it's not just about fixing companies, is it? It's about when they buy them.
That's the critical element. Opportunism. The real power of the LBO model, especially for giants like Blackstone, isn't just the financial engineering. It's seizing opportunities when everyone else is in trouble.
Like during a crisis.
Precisely. The sources detail how during the 2008-2009 financial meltdown, when credit markets froze and assets were plummeting, the big private equity firms were sitting on hundreds of billions in cash, ready to deploy. Blackstone alone apparently had nearly $30 billion.
So they could buy things cheap when sellers were desperate?
Exactly. They wait for the credit crunch, the market slide, the moment of maximum distress for others, and then they step in. That ability to deploy huge capital when assets are at fire sale prices is their ultimate leverage. It allows them to reshape entire industries on favorable terms.
Okay, so whether it's data or infrastructure or finance, you need a story to sell it, right? To keep investors, employees, everyone on board. The cult of the founder.
Absolutely essential. The narrative matters hugely. Look at Jeff Bezos and Amazon.
He managed to keep shareholders happy for decades with little or no profit, right? How?
Strategic consistency in his narrative. It's remarkable. Amazon was still losing money even as late as 2012, yet investors stayed loyal. Bezos achieved this, the sources argue, by relentlessly, consistently saying, "We are building for the long term. We are focused on the customer above all else."
Planting that flag and never moving it.
And he reinforces it constantly with simple, repeatable anecdotes. The sources mention him, often telling this story about the early days in the warehouse, realizing they needed packing tables so employees didn't have to kneel on the floor.
Seems minor, but what's the point he's making?
The point is about core values. Continuous improvement, finding simple, practical solutions, and obsessing over the customer and employee experience. By repeating these simple stories, these core tenets, over and over, he makes everyone, employees, suppliers, investors, feel like they understand the mission and are willing to wait for the payoff. They trust the narrative.
And this use of narrative for influence goes way back too, doesn't it? Thinking about someone like William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper mogul.
Oh, Hearst was a master of narrative as a tool for power. He didn't just report the news. He used his media empire to shape politics, public opinion, even consumer tastes.
And he was very conscious of his brand, right? Not wanting to be just like the establishment papers.
Highly conscious.
Yeah.
There's an anecdote where an editor suggested dropping the women's page from his papers because the prestigious New York Times didn't have one. Hearst's reaction was immediate. No. He insisted his papers had to be sufficiently different from the Times. His power came from reaching the masses, shaping popular culture, not just echoing the elite.
And he used his magazines too, like Good Housekeeping.
Yeah, the magazines were crucial. They built huge circulations, generated reliable advertising revenue, and that financial stability allowed his newspapers to take more political risks and subsidize his influence peddling. It was an integrated media machine designed for maximum reach and impact.
So when you have this much power controlling data, capital, narratives, it feels inevitable that ethical lines get blurred or sometimes just completely
But the
erased.
stakes get so high, billions of dollars, that the normal checks and balances can break down. And sometimes it tips into outright fraud or adopting, let's say, flexible moral frameworks.
Let's start with a really high-profile tech example, Theranos. How did that fraud actually work, according to the sources? It wasn't just hype, it was deception, right?
It was fundamental data misrepresentation.
Mhm.
Theranos, led by Elizabeth Holmes, convinced incredibly sophisticated investors, board members, partners like Walgreens, partly by showing them data, specifically scatter plots.
Okay, what did the plot show?
They purported to show that the results from Theranos' proprietary machines, the Edison or Minilab devices, were almost perfectly correlated with results from standard existing lab equipment. The clear message was, our revolutionary finger prick technology is just as accurate as the old way.
But that wasn't true.
That was the core deception. The sources reveal that a significant amount of the data points on those compelling charts didn't come from Theranos devices at all.
Wait, so where did they get the results?
They were often running the blood samples using conventional, commercially available analyzers they'd bought from other companies, like Biorad. Then they allegedly presented those results as if they came from their own Edison machines.
Wow. So faking the data to support the story.
It was a multi-billion-dollar valuation built, at least in part, on technologically misrepresented data, a foundational lie.
And when it started to unravel, how did Holmes react?
Classic crisis management playbook, perhaps. The sources describe how she distanced herself from and eventually fired her COO and then boyfriend, Sunny Balwani, effectively positioning him to take a lot of the blame for the operational and scientific failures.
Shifting the blame.
And, crucially, Theranos eventually had to void tens of thousands of blood test results sent to actual patients, including 2 full years of results from the Edison devices. That act of voiding all those tests was basically an admission to regulators that the core technology couldn't be trusted.
A devastating admission. Okay, let's shift to another recent implosion, FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried. The sources suggest his actions were underpinned by a specific philosophy.
Yeah, it's this concept of utilitarianism, often linked with the effective altruism movement.
Seeking the greatest good for the greatest number.
That's the basic idea. His parents were academic utilitarians, and Sam reportedly adopted this view. It led him to the idea of earning to give, making as much money as possible, even in morally gray areas like crypto trading, with the ultimate goal of giving it away to effectively help the largest number of people.
So the ends justify the means, essentially.
That seems to be the implication. And the sources note something interesting. This focus on the abstract greatest number potentially made it easier for him to disconnect from the impact on specific individuals around him.
Oh, so?
He's quoted as saying something to the effect that not having many close personal ties made it more natural for him to care about everyone in a general sense rather than anyone in particular, caring about the abstract future beneficiaries of his potential donations more than, say, his customers or employees right now.
And what was the consequence of running a multi-billion-dollar company with that kind of detached ends justify the means philosophy?
Well, the sources paint a picture of extreme operational looseness. Decisions made casually, risk management seemingly non-existent. There's an anecdote about how when calculating internal valuations or risk exposure, the instruction might just be to fill in a number.
Just make something up.
It suggests a profound lack of rigor, maybe driven by this belief that maximizing eventual good trumped meticulous present-day responsibility, and the price was catastrophic.
When it all came crashing down.
FTX collapsed, owing customers something like $8.6 billion. Funds just gone. And while Bankman-Fried might have been focused on that abstract greatest good, the sources highlight the very real immediate suffering. Employees losing life savings, people losing homes, relationships destroyed. It's a stark example of how prioritizing everyone, in theory, can devastate anyone in particular, in practice.
Okay, moving from tech ethics to Wall Street. Insider trading is the classic issue there, right? Getting an edge.
It's all about the informational edge. The sources focus on SA Capital and Stephen Cohen, known as the Whale, for his massive trading volume.
Yeah.
His whole model was apparently built on having better, faster information than anyone else, refusing to be the guy left trading on stale news.
And prosecutors went after him hard for insider
For
trading.
years, yeah. They were convinced he must have been trading on non-public information given his consistent outperformance. But proving he personally knew the information was illegal and traded on it directly proved very difficult.
So what did they do? They couldn't get him personally.
They pivoted. Instead of indicting Cohen the man, they indicted his firm, SAC Capital, as a corporate entity.
How does that work?
They use a legal principle sometimes called corporate attribution or respondent superior, which basically says that if an employee commits a crime while doing their job to benefit the company itself can be held criminally liable.
Ah, so they didn't need to prove Cohen gave the order, just that his employees were doing illegal things for the firm's benefit.
Essentially, yes. The firm, SAC Capital, eventually pleaded guilty to securities fraud, paid enormous fines, and had to shut down to outside investors. But Cohen himself avoided criminal charges. It shows how hard it can be to pin wrongdoing on the person at the very top of these complex financial organizations.
Finally, let's look at how massive wealth translates into political influence, shaping the rules of the game itself. The Koch network is a major example in the sources.
A huge, multi-decade effort. Charles Koch's strategy, starting with his early donor summits, was described as quite clever.
More than just fundraising.
Much more. The sources suggest these summits were designed as a way to get other wealthy conservatives and libertarians to help fund the political and intellectual battles that ultimately benefited the Koch industry's bottom line, particularly fights against environmental regulations or climate action.
So, leveraging other people's money for his company's political goals.
Yeah. It functioned like a highly sophisticated, privately funded extension of corporate lobbying, building a whole network dedicated to pushing a specific policy agenda.
And the strategy wasn't just lobbying politicians, right? It was broader.
Very broad. It involved careful messaging, framing a strongly anti-government, anti-regulation agenda as a nonpartisan movement for freedom and well-being. And a huge long-term focus, according to the sources, was on academia.
Funding universities, think tanks.
Yes. Pouring money into specific university departments, funding professorships, supporting student groups. The sources quote internal documents describing this as a great investment and a way to gain a significant competitive advantage by shaping the thinking of future leaders, economists, and policymakers, creating an intellectual pipeline for their ideology.
And we see a similar fierce defense when the finance industry itself feels threatened, like with the carried interest tax proposed.
Oh, the reaction to that was intense. Carried interest is the way private equity managers are compensated. It's taxed at a lower capital gains rate instead of ordinary income.
When politicians proposed changing that,
The industry pushed back hard.
extremely hard. Blackstone's founder, Stephen Schwarzman, made that infamous, wildly over-the-top comment comparing the tax proposal to when Hitler invaded Poland in 1939.
Wow, that's quite a comparison for a tax change. It shows the level of perceived threat. And it wasn't just him. The sources note that even many finance professionals who identified as Democrats politically threatened to stop donating to the party or shift money into private foundations rather than pay higher taxes on their earnings. They viewed increased government spending as pouring money into a deficit sinkhole.
So when it comes down to it, protecting their financial interests often overrides political loyalties. Capital defends itself.
It appears that way. The mobilization was immediate and intense, showing how effectively concentrated wealth can influence the political process to protect its advantages.
Okay, shifts in power often happen when old structures collapse, right? Creating a vacuum. The sources talk about the period after the Soviet Union fell, a commercial Wild West.
Absolutely. The collapse of the USSR in 1991 just shattered decades of established trade relationships, supply chains, and financial systems across Eastern Europe and the former Soviet republics.
Chaos, basically.
Total chaos. And these new, often unstable, cash-strapped countries desperately needed goods, investment, financing. But the big Western banks and multinational corporations were very hesitant to jump in.
Too risky. Too unstable.
Both. Plus, crucially, those established Western banks faced much stricter regulations and scrutiny back home about who they were doing business with and the risks involved. They couldn't easily operate in that kind of environment.
So, who filled the void?
This is where the big, often secretive commodity traders came in companies like Glencore, Vitol, Trafigura. They were used to operating in risky environments and, importantly, were less constrained by the banking regulations.
How did they operate?
They effectively propped up entire countries. They'd supply essential imports like oil or grain on credit when nobody else would. They'd pour money into resource extraction projects. They used complex financial tools like prepayments for future oil deliveries that allowed them to lend money outside the traditional banking system.
Taking huge risks, but potentially huge rewards.
Exactly. And by becoming the financiers and suppliers of last resort for these nations, they gain enormous economic leverage and, consequently, political influence. Their decisions, driven primarily by profit, could shape the fate of governments and economies, largely outside of public view or accountability. They became new kinds of global power brokers.
And this ties into how power reconsolidated within Russia itself under Putin.
Very much so. After the chaotic Wild West years and the financial crises of the late 90s, Vladimir Putin moved decisively to centralize control over Russia's vast resources. His system wasn't about creating a transparent, liberalized market.
It was more personal, based
No.
on loyalty.
Entirely. The sources describe him as becoming the ultimate dispenser of Russia's wealth. His model operates through personal connections, loyalty, and deals. If you played along, you were rewarded access to resources, state contracts, financing. If you resisted or challenged his authority.
You were punished, severely, like Khodorkovsky.
Precisely. It's a system of reward and punishment emanating directly from the center. And there's a striking example in the sources illustrating this hands-on control. The Pikilevo factory crisis.
What happened there?
Pikilevo was basically a company town, dependent on a single industrial complex. When disputes between the interconnected factories threatened shutdowns and mass layoffs, potentially causing social unrest.
Putin stepped in personally.
Directly. He didn't leave it to market forces or ministers. He flew there, personally hammered out the details of who would supply what materials, even directed the state-owned Russian railways on deliveries.
Micromanaging the supply chain.
But the key part was the public spectacle. He summoned the oligarch Oleg Deripaska, who owned part of the complex, and gave him an incredibly public, humiliating dressing down on television. Forced him to sign agreements on the spot.
What was the message there?
The message to every other powerful business figure in Russia was crystal clear. You will solve problems that threaten social stability, you will follow my direction, or you will face public humiliation and potentially much worse. It cemented his role as the absolute arbiter of the economy, operating through personal authority, not laws or markets.
Okay, so that's centralized state control. Let's look at another form of power based on infrastructure, but maybe more bureaucratic. Robert Moses in New York.
Ah, Robert Moses, a fascinating figure. His power wasn't based on personal wealth or holding high elected office for long. It was built on mastering bureaucracy and controlling infrastructure development.
How did he build that power base?
He strategically accumulated control over multiple overlapping public authorities, particularly those related to parks, parkways, and bridges. By holding key chairmanships simultaneously, often for decades, he essentially welded these entities together into a single, powerful machine responsive only to him.
So he controlled the planning, the land acquisition, the construction contracts, the funding streams.
Exactly. An infrastructure empire, largely insulated from direct political accountability to mayors or governors.
But the sources say he started out as an idealist, right? Fighting corruption.
He did. Early in his career, he was a reformer, wrote scathing reports on political patronage and inefficiency. But over time, he became what he apparently called a practical fellow.
Meaning he learned to play the game.
He learned that to achieve his grand, ambitious vision, building highways, bridges, parks on an unprecedented scale, he needed political cooperation. So he mastered the art of patronage himself.
How? By giving out jobs.
Yeah. He'd fill lower-level positions within his authorities with people recommended by legislators or party bosses. It wasn't about ideology. It was about building up political capital, favors owed. That way, when he needed support for one of his massive, often controversial projects, he could call in those chits and overcome opposition. He used the tools of the system he once criticized to achieve his own ends.
Using messy politics to build clean highways, maybe.
Something like that. And this idea of using infrastructure control or challenging it under an ideological banner, that's old too, isn't it? Like with a railroad baron.
Absolutely. Look at Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore. When he was aggressively muscling his way into the established ferry and railroad businesses, challenging the existing players.
He presented himself as the champion of the little guy.
Mm.
He literally sailed under the banner of free trade and equal rights. He denounced his established competitors as aristocratic monopolies, holding the public hostage.
Even though he was aiming to build his own monopoly.
Of course, the sources make it clear. It was circumstance, not deeply held principle, that made him sound like an idealist at that moment. Adopting the popular anti-monopoly language was a useful tactic when he was the disruptive outsider trying to break down the defenses of the entrenched players.
So the rhetoric, the narrative, is often just a tool in the service of gaining control, whether it's data centers or railroad lines.
It often seems that way. The pursuit of power and profit frequently requires wrapping itself in a more palatable public ideology.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. Data, capital, risk, narrative, control. We've tried to map this shifting landscape of global power. If you had to synthesize it, pull out the main threads for someone trying to understand this new architecture, what would they be?
I think it boils down to three interconnected engines driving modern power. First, definitely data centralization. The AI race showed us that whoever accumulates the most data, especially real-world behavioral data, gains a massive advantage. Quantity really matters, creating these powerful data monopolies.
Okay, data first. What's second?
Second is amplified risk-taking. We see this particularly in tech with figures who don't just manage risk, they actively court it, they amplify it, they push boundaries, force regulators' hand, and operate at speeds and scales that defy traditional caution. It's disruption as a core operating principle.
Right, the Musks of the world. And
Third is the enduring but evolving power of strategic capital. The old leverage points controlling essential infrastructure, like Lee Ka-ching's ports or Rockefeller's pipelines, still matter. But it's combined now with modern financial engineering, like the opportunism of private equity during crises and the strategic deployment of wealth to shape political and ideological landscapes, like the Koch network.
so data, risk, and capital. The new levers.
Those seem to be the key levers that these new titans are pulling.
So for you listening, this deep dive hopefully shows that understanding who really runs things today means looking beyond just governments and armies. You have to see the systems these powerful individuals and firms create and exploit.
Yeah, the algorithms they own, the financial structures they navigate, often opaquely, the political influence they wield, the way they step into voids left by traditional states. That's where the power dynamics are really playing out.
And maybe the most unsettling undercurrent we picked up from the sources is this drift towards, what was the term? Techno-utilitarianism.
Yeah, that logic where the goal is maximizing the system's output efficiency, profit control, maybe even a perceived greater good. But where the negative impacts on actual individuals, the collateral damage, can be dismissed as just externalities, necessary costs for optimization. We see elements of it in China's state-led approach and maybe in the justifications used in Silicon Valley blowups like FTX.
Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe something for you to chew on. If the biggest fortunes and the most potent forms of influence today are increasingly built not just on making a better mousetrap, but on monopolizing data flows, or expertly leveraging global crises, or bending political systems to your will, what's the ultimate price we all pay when innovation, governance, and maybe even society itself become optimized according to that hyper-efficient, data-driven, but potentially morally detached logic?